his tireless work in service to not just this community, but many communities for the sake of the gospel. You really have a gift in him, and I don't know if you get to see Nicole every now and then, but his wife Nicole, who is one of my wife's best friends, and so we're really grateful to have them as not just friends, but partners in ministry. I'd also like to thank Dr. Peter Cha, who has been a significant influence in my own life, and anyone else who have really made it possible for me to return to this gathering to share about the story of the Asian American Christian Collaborative, or AACC. I am especially grateful for Mosaic and all of its ministry arms, including this gathering, which I believe provides a meaningful and substantive space and community for those who are actually seeking to live out their faith and lead churches and Christian communities to bear witness to Christ and for Christ in the redemptive edges of our society. As I've heard from pastors throughout the entire country, that even beyond the pandemic and all of the problems that the pandemic has created, how ill-prepared so many of them were through their seminary educations to actually address the racial divides, the political polarization, the spiritual abuse, and the growing awareness of the gender disparities. And I realized through these discussions that Mosaic might be one of the few spaces within the evangelical world that offer some substantive vision and practical equipping for the church to navigate many of the challenges that Christians are called to tackle with courage. And so I hope you all know how blessed you are to have a space like Mosaic to shape your theological and pastoral imaginations. With that said, I do want to give special attention to Dr. Cha, who has really been a source of godly wisdom and insight in my own kind of life, and in the ways that he's shaped my own spiritual and Christian imagination to live as a kingdom witness until the Lord either returns or calls me home. And I pray that you do know that the significance of the gift that you have in him. But with that said, I'll share a little bit about the kind of the experience that we kind of went through over the last year, and tell the story of AACC, which I was asked to do. It was late of March 2020, just over a year and a half ago. A reporting mechanism had just been released by the newly formed coalition called Stop AAPI Hate. It was founded by three people: Russell Jung, Manjusha Kulkarni, and Cynthia Che. Stop AAPI Hate ended up documenting 673 instances of anti-Asian hate between March 19th to March 25th of 2020. That was just the first week that they started collecting data. In 1 week, with almost no publicity and very little awareness throughout the country of the effort and of the reporting mechanism, they gathered nearly 100 reports a day. We've been seeing stories here and there, the few of us that were in conversation together, but there really was no centralized reporting system at the time, which made it really hard and difficult to see how deep and how wide the issue was. But as soon as it was announced that the novel coronavirus came out of China, we knew that the situation could easily get tenuous. It's also important to note that just 1 week before the report was released, on March 16th, that former President Donald Trump tweeted out the phrase Chinese virus for the first time. The history of Asian America actually reveals that when it's convenient to blame Asian Americans for any societal issue, that we are actually blamed for it. All throughout history, we've been scapegoated as yellow peril, and the Asian invasion is something that we might have joked about growing up, but you can actually trace its painful history back for at least a century and a half. When the Chinese started to settle down in meaningful ways after completing the railroad that connected the nation from one coast to the other, the Page Act of 1875 was passed, which prohibited Chinese women, who were broadly categorized as immoral, from entering into the country in hopes that it would curb the population of Chinese Americans. Then we had the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which at first banned Chinese people from entering into the United States, until it turned into the Asiatic Barred Zone, where people from the majority of Asia, the entire continent, were prohibited from entering into the United States. Then during World War II, we witnessed the mass incarceration of 120,000 Japanese people in concentration camps, where by and large German Americans were taken as by a case on a case by case basis. Japanese Americans weren't afforded the same treatment. Again, considered a threat or a yellow peril for simply existing as people of Japanese descent, no matter how loyal they were to the country. In fact, I still remember a story of an elderly man who his grandson brought him to this church I was serving at, and he was telling me about the time that he grew up in the West Coast, and how when he was growing up, when he heard that Japan had attacked Pearl Harbor, that he pretended to be John Wayne shooting down the Japanese planes. And then the next moment, he and his family were told to pack up a single suitcase and put into a concentration camp. They lost everything as a result. In 1982, we saw the murder of Vincent Chin, a Chinese-American auto worker who was mistaken for being Japanese, as the Detroit auto industry was struggling to compete with the Japanese automakers, and he was bludgeoned and beaten to death at his own bachelor party. In 1992, we saw the LA riots, where the Korean-American community in LA was left largely neglected, as police officers set up patrols and barriers to prevent the rioting from entering into predominantly white neighborhoods on the north and towards Beverly Hills. And in 2001, after 9/11, we saw a rise in violence against the Sikh and South Asian population, who are often unfairly and unjustly stereotyped as terrorists, along with peaceful and law-abiding Arab Americans. Even my South Asian American Christian friends told me that they were called terrorists and screened at airports for simply existing in the bodies that God had given them. Which brings us to 2020. When the combination of a virus that is infectious and as deadly as COVID-19 being associated with China, and someone who holds the most powerful position in the entire nation and perhaps the entire world started calling the novel coronavirus Chinese virus or Kung flu, those of us who even had a cursory understanding of how racism functioned against Asian Americans or Asians in America knew that we were in a season for overt violence. This became especially concerning as the rhetoric we saw come out of President Trump's mouth started to emerge within the pews and in the boards and the elder boards of those we were in fellowship with. It was then that Jeff Leo, who's in California, Jay Katanis and I started messaging back and forth to talk about the disparaging remarks that we were hearing over and over and over again, especially coming out of church leaders. And so in order for us to preempt some of the violence that we were witnessing, we called for a group to assemble to help draft the statement on anti-Asian racism in the time of COVID-19. The first person I added to our group chat was Michelle Reyes, who serves as the vice president of AACC at the moment, since the beginning. And I still remember being up at 3 a.m. with Michelle and Jeff and Jay, and seeing other people like Russell Jung and Helen Lee and Viv Mabuni and Margaret Yu and Sun Chan Ra pop in and out of the document, and in order to kind of contribute their thoughts to add to the document. And as I did, it just looked like fireworks were going off on a Google Doc. Then when it was finished, we released it to the world, and just simply watched as the signatures started to come in. Now at this point, to be honest, I just thought, we'd get a few hundred, maybe 1,000 signatures tops. I never thought that within the first month of releasing the statement that we would get over 10,000 signatures. And that really changed the thinking in my own mind at that point. Because you have to remember, for a while now, people have been asking me that if I would ever be interested in starting anything for Asian American Christians, to which my consistent response was maybe at a future time. And the reason I asked, or the reason I kicked the can down the road, was because I always knew it was difficult, and how difficult it was to get people generally to care about Asian American issues, including fellow Asian Americans. But Asian American Christians I often found were the most difficult to convince to care about these issues because of the ways that we assimilate into the dominant white narrative. Asian Americans often like to be together, but we don't like to be seen together. And the ways that we're often rendered invisible makes us hyper-conscious about how we are perceived when we become visible to the broader public square. But when we started seeing thousands of people starting to sign onto the document, including a host of Christian leaders from seminary presidents and deans, including those that here at TEDS and Fuller and Princeton and Gordon Conwell and Vanderbilt and Pacific School of Religion and Claremont School of Theology and beyond, to the heads of the CCCU, Christianity Today, the Witness Black Christian Collective, Be the Bridge, World Relief, CCDA, the National Latino Evangelical Coalition, the AD Campaign, Sojourners, Red Letter Christians, the National Association for Evangelicals, InterVarsity and Christians for Social Action, and so on, it really became clear that this might be the moment where we form something to serve the needs of the Asian American Christian community and friends of our community as well. So quickly we pivoted towards forming an organization. One of the people who had asked me if I would ever be interested in starting an organization for Asian American Christians had actually begun to put money aside in hopes that I would at some point. And as soon as I told him that we were going to launch the organization, he and his wife wired me the money that they had accumulated for 6 months, which was a huge encouragement to me. Then through an African American friend named Charity, who graduated from Harvard Law, lawyers from a prominent law firm, Meyer Brown, offered to incorporate us pro bono. Host of volunteers from college age from college age to working professionals came out of the woodwork to really fill in the needed gaps. We had people who were in college to those who worked with college students, pastors and organizational leaders, editors and artists find ways to serve the Asian American Christian community through AACC. And over the course of the first year, we actually accomplished quite a bit, which I'm really grateful for the opportunity to even reflect on, which is probably the first time I did, in the last year and a half. Shortly after we formed the organization, we launched an online magazine called Reclaim, that we hope continues to serve as a repository for Asian American Christian thought, reflection, theology, and perspective into current issues and current events. And by creating a platform that's designed to amplify the voices of Asian American Christians and stories about Asian American Christians written by members of the Asian American Christian community and friends of our community, we really hope to create a living historical memory of how our voices from the margins are and were processing and theologizing through life and society. Perspectives that are oftentimes neglected. As one of the top 10 podcasts to listen to. In it, we try to find ways to equip the church by highlighting the voices, stories, scholarship, and perspectives that aren't always featured in the broader Christian world. In addition, as we saw how so many people were trying to navigate discussions around the rise of anti-Asian and anti-Black racism and violence, we put together a couple of resources to help the church and the world understand how a gospel reality helps us engage with real social issues, that the gospel has something meaningful to say about the social fractures of our day. One of the resources that was produced was called Interconnected, which was a collaboration with Be the Bridge, where we gathered Asian and Black Christian leaders from across the country to talk through the issues and the history of Asian-Black tensions, create and provide a biblical and theological rationale, and provide practical ways to move forward. In it were people like Jane Hong, Soon Chan Ra, Kemini Uwan, Christina Edmondson, both from Truth Tables podcast, Micah Edmondson, Christina's husband, Esau McCauley, Viv Babuni, and others who shared deep and important insights. The other resource we produced early on was Kairos, where we produced a series on engaging justice that were more ethnically focused within the Asian American community. We had an Indian panel, which was led by Michelle, a Filipino panel, which was led by Jay, a Chinese-Taiwanese panel that was led by Jeff, and then I led a Korean-American panel or dialogue for the church to utilize. And everything that I'm sharing at this point, from now probably till the end of our time together, is actually available on our website at aachristcollab.com or asianamericanchristiancollaborative.com. And if you follow us on social media, you can do so, AAChristCollab, Twitter and Instagram, and then of course make sure you subscribe to our newsletter if you haven't. In the midst of all this, I do remember feeling like we were burning the candle on both ends to put these resources together to meet the moment. But from the feedback that we were getting, it was very clear that we were producing materials and resources that were both timely and relevant, while being deeply Christian. On the heels of so many Black lives taken, it felt like our efforts needed to move towards creating understanding and healing to overcome the divides and create understanding between the Black and Asian American communities to promote deeper solidarity and cultivate true unity, as many people were doing it on the ground, but those efforts weren't being known and being seen in the broader kind of society. But then as we saw the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor, which led to a deep lament and a sense of urgency to get Asian American Christians to begin standing for racial justice, we knew that we had to accelerate on our efforts. And so we put all these resources out there. And then George Floyd was murdered. He was murdered. As I mentioned, we had been tracking with anti-Black racism and the efforts outside the church, namely through the Black Lives Matter movement, because far too many segments of the evangelical world and the white Christian world and the Asian Christian world, Asian American Christian world, had been silent, resistant, or even actively opposed to standing for racial justice, something that I think God would see as common sense. But when we all saw and witnessed the daylight lynching of George Floyd take place, like the rest of the world, we sought to respond. So after reaching out to a couple of pastors, I decided to put together a March for Black Lives and Dignity. I connected with Pastor Andrew Lee, David Wu, and Chris Javier at CCUC, which is a historic 100-plus-year-old Chinese-American church in Chinatown, who worked with the deacons to get their church involved, which they did. Then I contacted my friend, Pastor Charlie Dates, of a 100-plus-year-old Progressive Baptist church, who even during a time of deep lament and loss, as he had just lost his mother, offered to serve as the destination location of the march. The two churches, though about 1.5 miles apart down the same road, had never interacted until the march, which was a symbolic representation that we as Christians were bridging the divide between Black and Asian Americans, beginning with the church. We had many wonderful people participate, including Pastor Watson Jones and Jonathan Banks. Jay was there, Greg Lee was there, and there's a whole list of people that you can see who participated on our website. But we had about somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 people show up for the march. And it was remarkable to watch all these black-haired people march down the road. And one of the most consistent things I've heard as a response, even by Asian Americans who were initially reticent to go, was that marching was one of the most powerful and spiritually formative things that they'd ever done. In that march, they were able to see how Jesus and justice had been divorced for too long, and how a Jesus without justice was not a Jesus that they saw in the Bible, and that their faith actually compelled their feet to move towards injustice. By this point, we were regularly showing up also in the news outlets across the country, from Christianity Today to Christian Century, from Relevant to Religion News Service, from NPR to the Chicago Sun-Times, Sojourners to Faithfully Magazine. And our efforts were getting coverage in ways that I never anticipated. But the march really seemed to capture the imagination of the broader world in ways that I think the world was desperately hungry for. And I think when I kept speaking to these news outlets, the thing that they kept asking was what led Asian American Christians, and more specifically what led Asian Americans, and more specifically Asian American Christians, to actually march for Black Lives and Dignity. And it showed that we were trying to change the narrative, but also step into the gap where there had been a vacuum. But after the summer ended, things started to slow down for a couple months until the end of 2020 arrived and the beginning of 2021. And what we had seen throughout the pandemic was that in addition to the Burmese family that was stabbed, including two children that were under the age of 6 at a Sam's Club by someone who thought that they were Chinese and said that they were bringing in the virus. And in addition to an elderly woman who had acid thrown on her, a grandmother who was lit on fire as she was walking down the street, and another elderly woman that was drop-kicked while waiting at the bus station. As we were rounding out the year, we were beginning to witness a new surge of heinous violence against elderly Asian Americans. There was an 84-year-old Thai man, Visharattanapakdi, who was killed as he was just taking a walk around his neighborhood. There was Noel Quintana, a Filipino man who had his face slashed on the subway with a box cutter. Angelo Quinto, a 30-year-old Filipino Navy veteran who died after a police officer had his knee on his neck. Not much different from what we saw with George Floyd. It seemed like week after week a new video was being released. And Stop API Hate, at this point, had reported that anti-Asian incidents had risen to nearly 3,800 cases. This was by February 28, 2021. Then on March 16th, 2021, I don't know why I'm getting so emotional today. News about a shooting in Atlanta broke out. As the story unfolded and the details emerged, it was clear that this was a targeted attack on Asians. 8 people were killed, 6 of whom were women of Asian descent, mostly Chinese and Korean, who were mostly working low-wage jobs. They were killed by someone who was raised in the church. Despite being exhausted, once that happened, it became clear that another response was needed. I think I stayed up until 4 a.m. that night writing a piece for a religion news service, which was published the next day. And then at Wheaton, where I work, I began receiving a host of messages from our students about how the Asian and Asian American students were reeling, especially the Asian female students. At 10 a.m., despite having gotten almost no sleep, I announced that I would be hosting a prayer vigil at noon. And I simply told students to spread the word. Nearly 100 people showed up, including several members of the senior cabinet and faculty. Tears were shed, and I just remember breaking down as I cried out to God. The students continued to ask for support at Wheaton. So me and a couple faculty members, including Jordan Ryan and Greg Lee and Hanmi Kim, planned a series of events to process through all that was going on, mostly centered around caring for these Asian students with specific attention given to Asian women. We probably had like 3 or 4 events at that time. I still remember from one of the events that one of my female Korean American students from Atlanta stood up and asked a room full of 100 or so Asian American students and then friends of theirs to raise their hands if their churches had addressed the shootings the Sunday after it occurred. Maybe 3 hands went up. And I remember her saying how disheartened and disappointed that she was, that even in the midst of this type of tragedy, they were still being neglected and people were still debating if it was actually a racially motivated hate crime or not, instead of actually seeing the pain that was clearly there in the community. All this kept happening while pastors from all around the country kept telling me that they had no idea how to respond to any of the things that were going on because, again, their seminaries never trained them to address any of the things that they were facing. All this despite the fact that, and in light of the fact that black and brown people had been brutalized and killed for generations on end. Nothing is new, it's just being surfaced in new ways. While all this was taking place at Wheaton, I got in touch with some pastors in Atlanta to see if there was anything we could do to support their efforts. And working with local leaders, we decided to host a prayer rally in Atlanta. The date was set for March 28th, just 2 weeks after the shootings took place. It just so happened that I would already be in Atlanta to officiate the wedding on the 28th of a former student of mine at Wheaton and a TED's Mosaic alumnus named Isaiah Jung, who many of you will know, who would be married to Rachel. So that morning I officiated their wedding, and then that afternoon I went to the rally. As we began to announce, though, that we would be hosting a rally in Atlanta, a pastor here named Tiana Coleman, who's with the AACC, and a friend in Chicago, reached out and asked if she could help us organize anything in Chicago. She saw that we were going to do something in Atlanta. She said, can we do something in conjunction with that here in Chicago? She was at the March for Black Lives and Dignity and was encouraged by it. And being the really incredible human that she is, she was always looking for ways to practice the ministry of presence and solidarity, which is a tremendous gift. And it's extremely life-giving, especially in the midst of chaos and exhaustion. At first I thought there would be no way that we could execute the two events at the same time, but then she asked again, and this time I said, let's see who can help. So Jay Katanis and Juliet Liu, who's also a pastor in Chicagoland, said that they would be happy to take the point for Chicago with Tiana, and so we began to plan Chicago. Then one city after another, we ended up getting 14 cities involved in these rallies. I don't think that we could have ever imagined the turnout that we had. We had thousands of people show up across the country in rallies in 14 cities throughout the nation to stand for AAPI Lives and Dignity. And I think it's the first time that anything like this had ever happened. We had people that drove across state lines to attend these rallies. Many of whom, because they were so hungry and so desperate for a community and a space that would actually address these issues from a Christian perspective. There were several crazy stories, but one of the most moving ones was when a black pastor in Louisiana named J. Hill Richards and his wife Cobb, who happens to be Hmong, heard about the rallies and was hoping to attend with their kids. And they thought, if it ever comes to Texas, maybe we can go to the Texas one. But as soon as we announced Houston, they calculated the distance and found that it was too far because he would have to preach that Sunday and then make it. They would miss the rally by 2 hours. And then we announced that Austin was going to take place, and then they were like, we would still miss it. But they said if Dallas was ever announced, that they would show up. And thankfully, Dallas was announced. And so as soon as they ended their service, he preached his sermon, told his kids that they had to pee before they went to the car because they were not going to stop for any bathroom breaks, and drove 4 or 5 hours straight to Dallas so that they could worship and lament and grieve with others, and told me at the end of it that how blessed they were by it all. And they took their little kids who held up signs and were theologizing about the importance of protesting injustice. Theologian Paul Lim drove from Nashville to Atlanta, as did Alyssa Yukiko, I never know how to say her name, Waybright, I think, who's an art professor who also had been writing for AACC and contributing some incredible articles. And I can tell you story after story like this of people who drove for hours to mourn, lament, and grieve with fellow Asian American Christians all throughout the country. People from Detroit were planning on driving to Atlanta, but then when we announced that Detroit would happen, they were able to drive 30 minutes instead of the 10 hours or so that it would take. And through it all, I think the most consistent thing I heard was how powerful it was to hear the voices of women who weren't afraid to speak against the evils that they were witnessing. I had people texting me from all over the country about how powerful it was to hear from my wife Jessica, who spoke with such power and authority,
how it was powerful to hear from people like Michelle and Jay's wife, Lynn, and Juliet, and so on and so forth. They were transformed by just hearing the sound of their voices coming out of their bodies that God had designed. And these rallies felt like one giant cathartic event that really declared no to the evils of racism and sexism through the gathering of believers, and everyone who attended throughout the nation shared how deeply encouraged they were by it. The week after, back in Chicago, we hosted an event that had been planned for months, then entitled Black and Asian Christians United Against Racism at Apostolic Faith Church, with panelists again like Charlie Dates, Otis Moss III, Bishop Horace Smith, and Waltrina Middleton, along with Juliet Liu, Greg Lee Jay, David Wu, and Soon-Chan Ra. Powerful messages and testimonies were shared, including some powerful testimonies and responses by young Black and Asian Christians. A few months later, we hosted another event with Latino Christians at the Brook Church in Chicago, a church pastored by Eric and Erica Rivera, and it was beautifully moderated by Ricky Padilla of World Outspoken. But the statement that I think continues to ring in my head is from Sam George, who works with the Lausanne movement, who was one of the panelists who shared that in his 30 to 40 years of doing ministry, this was the first time he'd ever been to an event just like this. And then I think about what you do in Mosaic, week in and week out, and how precious that is, that you have something like this. One of the things I do want to say is that so much of my pastoral imagination and my kingdom efforts have really been shaped by the same influences that are shaping you here today. It's because of Dr. Peter Cha, who invested in me in ways that he did by taking his classes, bringing me in to help him plan different conferences, taking me out to meals, and listening to me process things. I was really given new visions and dreams for a just, multi-ethnic, multicultural Christian community that really seeks to live out of the reconciled reality between us and God. As a result, I believe that the world saw our good works and gave glory to our Father in heaven. I never thought that we would be quoted in the Washington Post, CNN, USA Today, Vox, and Essence magazine. I was quoted in Essence magazine. It's a Black women's magazine. I also never thought that ABC would include us in their Juneteenth special because of the collaboration between Charlie and myself. I was one of two non-Black folk in the entire 2-hour special that featured Barack Obama and John Legend. An Asian Christian guy was on a Juneteenth special. I also would have never imagined that non-Christian entities like Fortune 500 companies and governmental agencies would have any interest in working with an organization that has the word Christian in it. When the White House invited me to speak into certain issues, or when the mayor of Chicago's office asked me to serve on a committee to combat racism, which I'm currently on at the moment, the first thought I had was, do they even know that the first C in AACC stands for Christian? And when I asked them what led them to ask me to participate in the work that they invited me into, they often say that it's after they saw the work that we were doing, that they actually thought that it would be good to include some faith perspectives in the discourse. Stop API Hate has reported now nearly 10,000 cases of anti-Asian hate. Whether those numbers continue to grow at the rate they have been or not, one of the things that we know is that we are called to do justice, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with God. As a result, we know that there will always be work for us to do, whether it's for Asian American Christians or Asian American communities more broadly, or other marginalized communities. And we're still trying to grow and figure out what will look like as we mature as an organization, especially as we're always looking for good volunteers who want to help us become all that we can become, and donors who might be of interest in supporting our work. One of the things that we are committed to is both telling people and showing people that the good Lord Jesus is about the things that pain and hurt and harm those who are in the margins, who are oppressed and cast aside by the broader world. Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds and glorify your Father in heaven. I think that's the verse that stuck out as I was reflecting on this year and a half. And thank you for listening.